Case 1. Gary Ridgway. For 20 years, a truck painter in the Pacific Northwest maintained a record of perfect attendance, while the riverbanks nearby slowly filled with the remains of the missing. At least twice, authorities interviewed him, tested him, and cleared him, allowing him to return to the shadows of the Pacific Highway to continue his mission. He would eventually confess to 71 murders, making him the most prolific convicted killer in American history. His name was Gary Ridgway, and the limits of 20th century forensics, combined with a fragmented law enforcement response, made his 2-decade reign of terror possible. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the middle of 3 sons. His home life was defined by a fog of domestic volatility. He described his mother as a domineering and attractive woman with whom he had a deeply disturbed relationship, once admitting to an impulse to kill her during his adolescence. He was a bedwetter until his mid-teens, an embarrassment his mother handled with a mix of public humiliation and ritualized cleaning. After barely graduating from Tye High School with a 1.4 GPA and an IQ of 82, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served in Vietnam aboard a supply ship. Following his discharge in 1969, he married his high school sweetheart, but the marriage lasted only a year. 2 more marriages followed. To his neighbors in Auburn, Washington, he appeared to be a devoutly religious man who obsessed over his lawn and attended Pentecostal services. His co-workers at the Kenworth Truck Company, where he painted semi-trucks for 32 years, saw him as a dependable, if unremarkable, employee. That reputation protected him while he navigated a double life of sexual compulsion and violence. The women Ridgway targeted were not statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. Their ages ranged from 14 to 36, though many were what investigators described as young women on the mend. Individuals struggling to find their footing in a world that often looked the other way. 21-year-old Carol Ann Christensen was a mother and a waitress, balancing the demands of a professional life with the high-stakes responsibility of raising her young daughter. Following a recent separation, she was working toward a stable future and was planning her daughter's upcoming birthday. When she vanished on May 3, 1983, her family believed she would return. She was not supposed to die in a wooded area in Maple Valley. 16-year-old Opal Mills was just a teenager when she was lured into Ridgway's truck. Her mother, Kathy, would spend the next 2 decades in a state of unresolved mourning. What Ridgway did to those women followed a chillingly consistent pattern. He targeted women he perceived as disposable, primarily sex workers and runaways. "I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted and not get caught," he later told investigators. Itaketeard's primary weapon was manual or ligature strangulation, often from behind, to avoid a struggle. This method left no bullet casings or ballistic signatures for the Green River Task Force to track. He would then return to the sites where he had left the bodies, sometimes months later, to revisit the scenes of his crimes. Investigators noted that his murders often correlated with personal frustrations at home or work. Ridgway told detectives he had lived most of his life in a mental fog, and that he could not recall the names of most victims, only the specific physical details of their final moments. The pattern finally broke not through a patrol stop, but through the institutional failure of the 1980s, being corrected by 21st century science. In 1984, the Green River Task Force had Ridgway in their sights. He was interviewed and even passed a polygraph test. That failed investigative tool acted as a legal shield, allowing him to kill with impunity for another 17 years. It wasn't until 2001 that the King County Sheriff's Office utilized short tandem repeat, WAS TR, DNA, analysis to finally connect Ridgway's 1987 saliva sample to the biological evidence found on Carol Christensen. Detectives also identified a forensic artifact, microscopic spheres of Imron paint on the victim's clothing. The exact specialized industrial coating Ridgway had used at Kenworth for 3 decades. Much like the Pyxis machines that flagged Charles Cullen, these paint spheres provided a chemical map of Ridgway's movements. Ridgway never faced a jury. In 2003, he entered a life for bodies plea agreement, a controversial deal that spared him from the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of dozens of missing women. In total, he admitted to 49 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing proceedings, the clinical atmosphere of the courtroom was broken by Kathy Mills. While other families spoke of vengeance, she looked at the man who killed her daughter and said, "Gary Leon Ridgway, I forgive you." It was the only moment during the entire process that the man who had remained emotionless for years finally broke down and wept. On December 18, 2003, Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. A 49th sentence was added in 2011. At the sentencing, family members filled the gallery to confront the man who had stained their community. One relative told Ridgway, "You have bloodied and stained the very ground we walk on." Judge Jones told him, "You have betrayed every principle of human decency." Ridgway offered no satisfactory explanation for his decades of violence, stating only that he had a problem he couldn't control. The Ridgway case forced Washington state to pass the Green River Law Protocols, which overhauled how missing persons cases are reported and investigated, specifically for high-risk populations. But the law came too late for the victims whose disappearance had been met with silence. Gary Ridgway is 77 years old. He is incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he will remain until his death. The families of his victims, as many as 80 in total, continue to seek the answers he took with him into the silence of his life sentence. Case 2. Samuel Little. Across 19 states and 35 years, a nomadic drifter moved through the American interior, hiding his crimes in the margins of society where the law rarely looked. While local jails processed him for over 100 counts of petty theft and assault between 1956 and 2012. The true scale of his violence remained invisible to a justice system that lacked a unified interstate tracking system. Administrators at regional facilities recorded his fingerprints. Judges sentenced him for minor infractions. And then they watched in silence as he drifted into the next jurisdiction to find his next target. By the time the forensic record caught up to him, he had claimed at least 93 lives, establishing himself as the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. His name was Samuel Little, and a fragmented law enforcement infrastructure, combined with a profound societal indifference toward his victims, made his 35-year reign of terror possible. Samuel Little, born Samuel McDowell, on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, was raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. He described a childhood defined by a fog of displacement, claiming his mother was a sex worker who had abandoned him at birth. Little was a high school dropout who spent much of his youth in juvenile detention centers, beginning a cycle of incarceration that would span his entire adult life. He was a competitive boxer, a skill that provided him with a lethal precision he would later weaponize against his victims. During his service in various county jails, he was often noted for his high intelligence but lack of impulse control. Between his numerous prison stints, he lived as a nomad, traveling in a succession of vehicles, including a 1978 yellow Cadillac Eldorado, which functioned as mobile crime scenes. To the police who arrested him for shoplifting and DUI, he appeared to be nothing more than an aging, indigent drifter. That low-profile, transient reputation protected him while he navigated a double life of pathological violence. The women Little targeted were not statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers with families and futures that were cut short. Their ages ranged from 16 to 50, though many were what investigators later described as people on the mend, individuals struggling with addiction or poverty who were attempting to stabilize their lives. 32-year-old Denise Christie Brothers was at a motel in Odessa, Texas on January 1st, 1994, when she crossed paths with Little. She was a mother of two who had been reported missing on New Year's Day. Her body was not found until February 2nd, 1994, in a vacant lot. Decades earlier, on New Year's Eve in 1970, Little committed his first confirmed murder in Homestead, Florida, killing 33-year-old Mary Jo Brosley. Her family in Massachusetts never stopped looking for her, but for 48 years, her case remained a cold Jane Doe file, a placeholder name used by the system for the unidentified, because Florida authorities could not link her remains to a missing person report in another state. What Little did to those women followed a chillingly consistent pattern. Between 1970 and 2005, he administered lethal force through his own physical training. Using his boxing background, he would deliver a powerful stun blow to the abdomen or jaw to knock his victims unconscious. He then utilized manual strangulation, a method he preferred because it left no obvious ballistic or sharp force signatures for police to track. Because of this, many coroners misclassified his murders as accidental overdoses or natural causes due to the high-risk lifestyles of his targets. Little made requests for information that were ignored by local police, a pattern of investigative silence that should have triggered national alarms. When asked why he killed, Little claimed he was doing what he felt he was meant to do. Investigators saw it differently, concluding that he killed for his own narcissistic needs. The murders often correlated with his personal crises, his releases from prison, his financial failures, and his deepening sense of detachment from society. The pattern finally broke on September 5th, 2012, at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. After an arrest on an outstanding narcotics warrant, his DNA was uploaded to the CODIS database, triggering a cold hit for the 1987 and 1989 murders of Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca in Los Angeles. The system had finally flagged him. Once the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, MVICAP, was involved, analysts Christie, Palazzolo, and Angela Williamson moved to bridge the gap between states. They approached Texas Ranger James Holland, an expert in psychological interrogation, who conducted a series of interviews in 2018. During these sessions, Little began a forensic confession, producing hauntingly accurate charcoal portraits of the women he had killed. These portraits allowed the FBI to link his confessions to over 60 confirmed cold cases that had been buried for years. Samuel Little never faced a traditional jury for the vast majority of his crimes. In September 2014, he was convicted in California for 3 murders and sentenced to life without parole. On December 13th, 2018, he pleaded guilty in Ector County, Texas, to the murder of Denise Christie Brothers to avoid the death penalty. In total, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. A mental evaluation found him competent with an IQ in the average range, and his attorneys never pursued an insanity defense. During the Texas proceedings, Little remained chillingly detached, recounting the deaths of his victims with a photographic memory for detail that unsettled the court. At sentencing, he often looked away from the families of the people he had killed, refusing to offer the closure they sought. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died at the age of 80 in a California prison. His death brought a close to the most extensive murder investigation in American history. But the damage he inflicted remained permanent for the families of the 93 women he targeted. At his various sentencings, family members spoke of the ruins he left behind. One relative told the court, "You took someone who mattered to us, even if she didn't matter to you." Ector County District Attorney Bobby Bland noted that without these confessions, the truth for many families would have died with Little. In his final interviews, he offered no satisfactory explanation for his decades of violence. The Little case forced the United States to pass more rigorous reporting standards for unidentified remains through the VICAP overhaul. This mandate ensures that Jane Doe cases are tracked nationally, rather than being lost in local filing cabinets. But the protocols came too late for the victims whose disappearance had been met with decades of institutional silence. Samuel Little is gone, but the mystery of his true victim count remains. Researchers believe many of his victims will never be confirmed because the small-town departments that handled his early cases often destroyed their records. Samuel Little was a predator who lived in the fog of a fragmented system, and he remains the ultimate proof that when the justice system ignores the marginalized, it creates a sanctuary for the killer. Case 3. Israel. Case from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the quiet suburbs of Vermont. A meticulous contractor treated the act of murder with the same cold, calculated precision he used to build homes in the wilderness. While the FBI's behavioral analysts focused on regional predators, this man operated outside the traditional killing field, exploiting the gaps in the nation's post-9/11 aviation and banking infrastructure to remain invisible. He would fly across the country, rent vehicles under his own name, and drive 1,000 miles to a kill kit he had buried years in advance, ensuring that no local purchase or digital footprint could ever link him to his crimes. By the time he was apprehended in 2012, he had shattered the myth of the local serial killer. His name was Israel Keys, and a national security apparatus that focused on foreign threats while ignoring the movement of domestic predators made his decade-long spree possible. Israel Keys was born on January 7th, 1978, in Cove, Utah. The second of 10 children raised in the fog of extreme survivalism. His family eventually moved to the remote woods of Colville, Washington, where he grew up in a household defined by white supremacist ideologies and a total detachment from modern society. This isolation fostered a self-reliant, predatory mindset from a young age. After a 3-year stint in the U.S. Army at Fort Lewis from 1998 to 2001, where he served in the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, Keys moved to Anchorage, Alaska, to start his own business, Keys Construction. To his neighbors, he was a hard-working, soft-spoken handyman and a dedicated father who was often seen playing with his young daughter. His co-workers saw him as a man of surgical focus who took pride in his craftsmanship. That mask of mundane reliability protected him while he spent his vacations traveling the lower 48, scouting locations for the specialized caches of weapons and disposal tools he would use to commit untraceable crimes. The victims Keys targeted were not statistics. They were individuals with lives of purpose that were violently interrupted by his randomized selection process. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was a barista at a small coffee stand in Anchorage on February 1st, 2012, when her path crossed with Keys. She was a young woman on the mend, working long shifts at common grounds to save money and planning a future with her boyfriend. She was a daughter whose father, James Koenig, described her as the heart of their family. Samantha was not supposed to be taken from her place of work under the cover of darkness. For weeks, her disappearance was treated as a kidnapping, while her family maintained a public vigil and raised reward money. It wasn't until months later that the horrifying reality emerged. Keyes had not only killed her the night of the abduction, but had later used her image in a staged ransom photo. He sewed her eyes open and applied makeup to her face to make it appear she was still alive in the Polaroid, a forensic artifact of his extreme depravity, designed to buy him time to travel and access her bank accounts. What Keyes did followed a chillingly unique technical pattern. He utilized kill kits, specialized Home Depot buckets filled with handguns, silencers, zip ties, and lye, which he buried in remote areas across Vermont, New York, and Washington, years before he intended to use them. This logistical foresight meant that when he arrived in a state to kill, he never had to buy a weapon or visit a hardware store where a clerk might remember his face. He treated his crimes like a construction project, scouting the site, preparing the materials, and executing the job with clinical efficiency. "I was two different people," Keyes told FBI investigators during his detention. "I was a family man at home, and I was a monster on the road." His double life was supported by his ability to exploit the anonymity of American travel, using cash and stolen debit cards to move through 19 states without triggering a single alert. The pattern finally broke on March 13th, 2012, in Lufkin, Texas. The system failure that had protected him was finally bridged by a digital trail. Following the abduction of Samantha Koenig, Keyes had committed a fatal error. He used her stolen debit card at ATMs across the Southwest. The FBI's cyber division tracked the withdrawals in real time, allowing Texas authorities to conduct a high-stakes traffic stop on his white Ford Focus. Inside the vehicle, they found Koenig's cell phone and debit card. While the physical evidence linked him to one crime, it was the subsequent interrogation that revealed the institutional gap. Keyes admitted that he had traveled over 3,000 miles to commit a murder, a geographic anomaly that the FBI's traditional profiling models, which assumed serial killers stayed within a comfort zone, had never accounted for. Israel Keyes never faced a jury for the murders he committed. On December 2nd, 2012, while awaiting trial in an Anchorage jail, he used a concealed razor blade to commit suicide, taking the locations of his remaining victims with him. He left behind a blood-stained suicide note filled with nihilistic poetry, but no list of names. A mental evaluation during his brief incarceration found him highly intelligent and legally sane, but noted a pathological need for total autonomy. During his final interviews with FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin, Keyes remained detached, offering only bits and pieces of the truth in exchange for small luxuries like cigars and Americano coffee. He confessed to the murders of Bill and Lorraine Courier in Vermont, another couple who were targeted simply because their home lacked a basement and was easy to access. Another cold, structural calculation. The Keyes case forced a massive overhaul in how the FBI and the Department of Justice track long-distance nomadic predators. It highlighted the need for the Keyes protocols, integrating flight manifests, rental car data, and ATM withdrawals to flag suspicious patterns of high-frequency travel. But the changes came too late for Samantha Koenig and the estimated 11 other victims whose lives were treated as construction debris by a man who saw himself as a god of his own making. The system failure here was not a lack of effort by local police, but the lack of a national connect-the-dots infrastructure that could see a handyman in Alaska as a threat in Vermont. Israel Keyes is gone, but the kill kits he buried across the American landscape remain a haunting reminder that a predator's greatest weapon is often the very system designed to move a modern world. Case 4. John Edward Robinson. In the late 1990s, while the world was marveling at the birth of the digital age, a man in the American Midwest was discovering how to turn the anonymity of the internet into a lethal weapon. While families were installing their first dial-up modems, this predator was navigating early chat rooms, using a sophisticated blend of corporate jargon and psychological manipulation to lure women into his orbit. He didn't hide in the shadows of back alleys. He hid in plain sight as a respected businessman, a Boy Scout leader, and a philanthropist in Olathe, Kansas. By the time the digital trail finally caught up to him in 2000, he had claimed at least 8 lives, earning him the title of the world's first internet serial killer. His name was John Edward Robinson, and a legal system that failed to understand the dangers of the early World Wide Web allowed his 2-decade spree to persist. John Edward Robinson was born on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois, and was raised in the fog of a strict, lower-middle-class household. His early life was defined by an obsession with status and authority. He even attended a Catholic seminary with the intent of becoming a priest before pivoting to a life of white-collar crime. By the 1980s, Robinson had established a pattern of embezzlement and fraud, serving prison time for stealing from his employers. Despite this, he possessed a chameleon-like ability to reinvent himself, eventually being named Man of the Year by a local association for his charitable work. To his wife and 4 children, he was a provider and a pillar of the community. This mask of high-functioning respectability provided him with the social capital necessary to convince his victims that his professional offers were legitimate opportunities. The women Robinson targeted were not statistics. They were ambitious, capable individuals who were often what investigators described as on the mend, seeking new career starts, educational funding, or financial independence. 27-year-old Suzette Troughton was a veterinary technician and a graduate student with a bright future. In early 2000, she believed she had found the opportunity of a lifetime, a personal assistant position for a wealthy businessman that paid $60,000 a year and included international travel. She was not supposed to vanish into the rural Kansas landscape. Her mother, Carolyn Troughton, would later testify that Suzette was excited about starting over and finding a mentor. But Robinson had spent months grooming her through emails and chat rooms under the pseudonym Slave Master, creating a digital trap that Suzette had no reason to suspect until she arrived at his property. What Robinson did to those women followed a chillingly modern technical pattern. He utilized the employment contract as his primary weapon of manipulation, a tool he had perfected during his years as a con artist. He would require his victims to sign documents that effectively handed over control of their lives, their finances, and their communications to him. He was a pioneer in digital identity theft, using his victims' computers and personal stationery to send messages to their families, claiming they had moved away or started new lives in secret. This created a forensic buffer of silence that lasted for years. When he finally killed, he utilized blunt force trauma and disposed of the remains in 85-pound chemical drums, which he stored on a desolate 15-acre farm in Lynn County. He believed that the transition from the physical world to the digital one would make the bodies irrelevant, assuming that as long as the emails kept coming, no one would look for the physical remains. The pattern finally broke in June 2000 through a system failure that was corrected by a new generation of investigators who understood the value of a digital footprint. Following a sexual assault complaint from a woman who managed to escape his slave master contract, police obtained a search warrant for Robinson's property and his computer equipment. For the first time, investigators didn't just look for blood, they looked for data. They discovered a hidden trail of emails sent to Suzette Truton and another victim, Isabella Lewicka. On his farm, a K9 unit alerted to 2 large chemical drums. When technicians opened them, they found the remains of Suzette and Isabella. The institutional failure here was the lack of an interstate missing persons database that could have connected Robinson to the 1985 disappearance of Sheila Strope or the 1984 murder of Beverly Bonner decades earlier. John Edward Robinson was tried in 2002 in Johnson County, Kansas. The prosecution presented a mountain of digital evidence, including the slave master chat logs and the detailed logs Robinson kept of his contracts. The defense attempted to argue that the BDSM nature of the relationships was consensual and that the deaths were accidental. But the jury was not swayed by the clinical depravity of his records. On October 29, 2002, Robinson was convicted of multiple counts of capital murder and was sentenced to death. A mental evaluation described him as a malignant narcissist who viewed other human beings as mere commodities to be traded or discarded for personal gain. He showed no remorse during the sentencing, maintaining the same stoic, businessman-like demeanor he had used to lure his victims into his digital web. At sentencing, family members spoke of the men and women who had been erased by Robinson's narcissism. One relative told the court that Robinson had not just killed their daughter, but had stolen her voice by impersonating her for years through forged letters. This administrative murder, the act of keeping a person alive on paper while their body lay in a chemical drum, was a hallmark of Robinson's method. Prosecutors argued that the cruelty of his crimes was compounded by the fact that he used the very technology meant to connect the world to isolate his victims. The judge, in imposing the death sentence, noted that Robinson's actions represented a new and terrifying frontier in criminal behavior. The Robinson case forced the FBI and the Department of Justice to develop the first protocols for cyber profiling and the tracking of internet-based predators. It served as a grim warning that the system failure of the digital age was its inherent trust in anonymity. The changes in how police monitor online grooming and the integration of the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NMUS, came too late for Suzette Truton and the other women who believed they were signing a contract for a better life. John Edward Robinson is currently 82 years old and remains on death row in Kansas, the oldest inmate in the state's history. He is a reminder that while the tools of the killer may change with technology, the fog of their upbringing and the vulnerability of those on the mend remain the constant, tragic variables of the hunt. William George Davis, Vicki Dawn Jackson, and Rita Mays exploited the trust of the hospital. John Edward Robinson exploited the trust of the new frontier. Each case highlights a specific period where the infrastructure of our society, whether medical or technological, outpaced our ability to secure it. Robinson's use of 85-pound drums and slave master aliases is a physical and digital artifact of a time when the internet was a lawless space. Today, his case is taught to federal agents as the blueprint for how digital forensics can bridge the gap between a missing person report and a recovered victim. He remains incarcerated, awaiting an execution that may never come, while the families of his victims continue to navigate a world that Robinson tried to convince them their loved ones had abandoned. Case 5. Todd Kohlhepp. Beginning in 2003, the quiet rural landscape of Spartanburg County, South Carolina, became the backdrop for a decade-long exercise in predatory camouflage as a successful real estate broker began building a private killing field. While the local community saw a high-achieving go-getter who had seemingly rehabilitated after a teenage prison stint. Todd Kohlhepp was actually using his six-figure commissions to purchase and fortify a 96-acre plot of land in Woodruff. He didn't stalk his victims in the traditional sense. Instead, he exploited the professional trust granted by his brokers, licensed to lure unsuspecting workers to his remote property under the guise of legitimate employment. For 13 years, he existed as a ghost in the system, a man who was simultaneously a pillar of the local business community and a collector of human lives who hid his depravity behind the professional shield of a respected career. Todd Christopher Kohlhepp was born on March 7th, 1971, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and was raised in the fog of a childhood defined by explosive aggression and psychological instability. At age 15, he committed a brutal kidnapping and sexual assault in Arizona that was so severe he was sentenced to 15 years in an adult prison. During his incarceration, he proved his intelligence by mastering computer science, but prison psychologists noted he remained preoccupied with sexual deviancy. Upon his release in 2001, he moved to South Carolina and exploited a loophole in the real estate board's background checks to become a licensed broker. To his clients, he was an expert in local land deals. To his neighbors, he was the guy with the expensive tactical gear and the massive, locked farm. This mask of professional utility allowed him to purchase a 96-acre property without a single red flag being raised. The victims Kohlhepp targeted were often individuals like Calla Brown, a 30-year-old woman who was on the mend and building a small business with her boyfriend, Charlie Carver. In August 2016, they accepted a job to clear brush on Kohlhepp's Woodruff property, believing the professional credentials of the man hiring them guaranteed their safety. Kayla was a survivor, a woman looking for a fresh start, but she was not supposed to witness her boyfriend being executed with 3 shots to the chest the moment they stepped out of their car. Kohlhepp didn't kill Kala. He collected her, chaining her by the neck and ankles inside a 30-foot metal shipping container. For 65 days, she lived in total darkness and isolation, a forensic artifact of Kohlhepp's need for total ownership, while he taunted her with the graves of his previous victims. What Kohlhepp did followed a chillingly modern technical pattern defined by digital arrogance. He utilized his Amazon account to leave technical clues in plain sight, reviewing tactical shovels, locks, and chains with commentary that detailed their effectiveness for burial and restraint. He reviewed a folding shovel by stating it was great for hiding bodies when you left the full-size one at home. This was a forensic failure of the digital age. Law enforcement had no system to monitor the e-commerce behavior of registered sex offenders, even when they were purchasing the literal tools of kidnapping. Kohlhepp believed his wealth and his professional standing made him untouchable, a super predator who could hide his depravity in the comments section of a retail giant. The pattern finally broke on November 3rd, 2016, through a system failure that was corrected by cellular data analysis. After Kayla and Charlie vanished, investigators tracked the last ping from Charlie's cell phone to Kohlhepp's property. When tactical teams raided the land, they heard a rhythmic banging coming from the locked shipping container. They cut the padlocks and found Calla Brown alive, chained like a dog inside. The institutional failure was immediately apparent. The South Carolina Real Estate Commission had allowed a man with a violent kidnapping conviction to hold a license that gave him access to private homes and the trust of the public. Kohlhepp's status as a respected businessman had been the only thing preventing a deeper look into his activities years earlier. Upon his arrest, Kohlhepp's narcissism took over. He negotiated his confessions like real estate deals, leading police to the shallow graves of Charlie Carver and 2 other victims, Megan and Johnny Coxey. Most shockingly, he confessed to the 2003 Superbike Motorsports quadruple homicide, cold case that had haunted the town of Chesney for 13 years. He claimed he killed the 4 employees because they had laughed at him during a motorcycle lesson. This confession exposed the administrative failure of the 2003 investigation. Kohlhepp had been in the shop's customer files, but because he was a successful professional, he was never considered a suspect in a mass execution. His trophy room wasn't a shelf of trinkets. It was his 96-acre farm, where he walked among the graves of those who had disrespected him. Todd Kohlhepp was sentenced on May 26, 2017, in a Spartanburg County courtroom. He pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder and 2 counts of kidnapping to avoid the death penalty, a final manipulation of the system he had exploited for over a decade. Judge J. Durham Cole sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences, plus 60 years. Throughout the sentencing, Kohlhepp remained stoic and unrepentant, even as Calla Brown provided a harrowing impact statement about the 65 days of hell she endured in the container. The prosecution presented the Amazon reviews and the tactical gear found in his home as evidence of a man who had been planning his private war on society since the day he left prison in 2001. The Kohlhepp case forced a total reckoning regarding the oversight of professional licenses for violent felons. It led to the Calla Brown law in South Carolina, which mandates more rigorous background checks for real estate and other professional licenses involving home access. It also highlighted the danger of administrative blindness, where a high-functioning sociopath can use professional success to divert forensic attention. Today, the Woodruff property has been cleared, but the case remains a landmark in forensic psychology, studied for its unique intersection of professional status and extreme serial violence. Todd Kohlhepp didn't have the hospital access of Charles Cullen. He had a Zillow account and a 96-acre killing field. He is a reminder that a professional mask can be the most dangerous weapon in a predator's arsenal. While technology eventually caught up to him through his cell phone pings, the 13 years he spent selling homes while burying bodies remains a debt the system is still paying. He remains in the Broad River Correctional Institution, a man who believed his intelligence made him a god, but whose legacy is now defined by the metal container where his reign of terror finally ended. Case 6. Sean. Great. For a decade between 2006 and 2016, a transient predator moved through the decaying residential blocks of north central Ohio, realizing that the post-recession system failure of abandoned real estate could serve as a perfect, invisible graveyard. While city officials struggled with a growing inventory of foreclosed and condemned houses, this man was treating these rotting structures as his private hunting grounds and disposal sites in Ashland, Richland, and Marion counties. He didn't just hide in the shadows. He hid inside the urban blight that neighbors had learned to ignore. By the time a desperate 911 call from a kidnapped woman finally exposed him in September 2016, he had successfully avoided detection by blending into the margins of society. His name was Sean Great, and a society that looked away from both its abandoned buildings and its invisible citizens allowed him to operate as a modern-day phantom. Sean Michael Great was born on August 8, 1976, in Marion, Ohio, and was raised in the fog of a family fractured by divorce and early instability. His transition into adulthood was marked by a parasitic lifestyle. He was a chameleon who relied on his good looks and soft-spoken demeanor to manipulate women into providing him with food and shelter. By 2006, he had begun a cycle of violence that was largely shielded by his nomadic existence. To the women he met, he was a struggling artist or a handyman who had fallen on hard times. To the legal system, he was a low-level repeat offender whose domestic violence calls were treated as isolated incidents. This mask of the harmless drifter provided him with the freedom to frequent soup kitchens and homeless camps, where he could identify victims who, like him, existed on the margins of the system. The women Great targeted were often on the mend. Individuals like 29-year-old Elizabeth Griffith, who was striving for independence despite her intellectual disabilities. In August 2016, Griffith vanished while walking in Ashland. She was a woman who valued her routine and her connections to her family, but her vulnerability made her an easy target for Great's helpful persona. Great lured her into an abandoned house on 4th Street, a structure so dilapidated that neighbors assumed it was empty. He didn't just take her life, he kept her in a state of terror, using the sound-dampening insulation of the rotting house to ensure her screams went unheard. Her disappearance was initially met with the typical institutional failure associated with adults on the margins. Police were slow to launch a full-scale search, assuming she had simply wandered off or left of her own accord. What Great did followed a technical pattern of structural exploitation. He utilized his background as a house painter to identify properties that were officially condemned, but still had functioning locks or accessible crawl spaces. He used manual strangulation as his primary method, a choice that left no ballistics and avoided the loud evidence of a firearm. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the forensic buffer of decay. By placing bodies in the basements and bedrooms of abandoned houses, he allowed the natural odors of rotting wood and urban refuse to mask the smell of decomposing remains. He was a pioneer of squatter murder, realizing that in a city with hundreds of empty homes, the police were unlikely to conduct a door-to-door search of properties without a specific warrant or tip. The pattern finally broke on September 13th, 2016, through a system failure that was corrected by the sheer will of a survivor. A woman identified only as LS managed to free herself from her restraints while Great was asleep in an Ashland bedroom. She used Great's own cell phone to place a whispered 18-minute 911 call that remains one of the most harrowing pieces of evidence in Ohio history. When police arrived at 363 4th Street, they found the survivor, but they also found the technical failure of the previous search efforts. The bodies of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacy Hicks were found inside the house, one hidden in a bedroom and the other in the basement. The institutional failure was the realization that Great had been living in this empty house for weeks, right under the noses of a community that had simply stopped seeing the building as part of the neighborhood. Upon his arrest, Great's narcissistic vanity led him to confess to more than just the Ashland murders. He led investigators to a site in Richland County where he had killed Rebecca Lisi in 2015, a death that police had previously and erroneously ruled an accidental overdose. He also confessed to the 2006 murder of a Jane Doe in Marion County, whom he had killed because she hadn't thanked him for a ride. This administrative murder, misclassifying a homicide as an overdose, was the ultimate shield for Great. As long as the police believed the deaths were self-inflicted by addicts, they never looked for a killer. Great's confessions were punctuated by a strange, calm detachment, as he described his victims as gifts or tasks he had completed. Sean Great was tried in 2018 in Ashland County. The prosecution presented the 911 call as the voice from the grave that Great never expected to hear. The defense attempted to argue not guilty by reason of insanity, but psychological experts testified that Great was a calculating sociopath who understood exactly what he was doing. On June 1st, 2018, he was sentenced to death for the murders in Ashland. He later received life sentences for the Richland and Marion County murders. Throughout the proceedings, Great remained an attention seeker, writing letters to local news stations and attempting to maintain his charming persona, even as the families of his victims described the holes he had left in their lives. The Great case forced the state of Ohio to confront the dangers of abandoned properties. It led to the Land Bank initiatives intended to demolish or secure blighted houses more quickly, removing the infrastructure of concealment that Great had perfected. It also highlighted the critical need for police to re-examine overdose deaths in transient populations, leading to the reopening of dozens of cold cases across the Midwest. The system failure was the assumption that if someone is homeless or struggling, their death is their own fault rather than the work of a predator. Sean Great remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, his execution date pending. He didn't have the digital trail of John Robinson or the medical access of Charles Cullen. He had the rot of a city. He is a reminder that the most dangerous killers are those who understand which parts of our society we have chosen to ignore. While the survivor, LS, was saved by her own courage, the 10 years Great spent living among the dead stands as a testament to the fact that when we abandon our neighborhoods, we leave them to the ghosts and the monsters who live among them. Case 7. William Devin Howell. In 2003, the industrial landscape of New Britain, Connecticut, became the hunting ground for a nomadic predator who utilized the anonymity of a blue Ford Econoline van to carry out the most prolific serial killing spree in the state's history. While the local police department dealt with the daily challenges of a city struggling with poverty and addiction, William Devin Howell was methodically selecting victims from the margins of society, women whose disappearances were often dismissed as voluntary due to their transient lifestyles or struggles with substance abuse. He didn't require a permanent residence or a hidden basement to facilitate his crimes. Instead, he transformed his vehicle into a mobile murder room that allowed him to kill and coexist with his victims in plain sight. For over a decade, the bodies of 7 people lay undiscovered in a garden of evil, just feet away from a busy suburban shopping center, shielded by a system failure of fragmented missing persons reports. William Devin Howell was born on February 11th, 1970, in Hampton, Virginia, and was raised in the fog of a life defined by transience and a lack of social anchors. By his early 30s, he had moved to Connecticut, where he found work as an unlicensed handyman, a position that allowed him to roam through residential neighborhoods without arousing suspicion. He was a man who existed entirely outside the traditional structures of society, living in a 1985 Ford Econoline van that served as his bedroom, his workspace, and eventually his primary weapon. To the people who hired him to mow their lawns, he was merely a quiet drifter. However, behind this mask of insignificance was a man with a burgeoning necrophilic obsession. This lack of a fixed address provided him with a forensic invisibility that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track his movements across municipal lines. The victims Howell targeted were frequently women like Melanie Ruth Camellini, a 29-year-old mother who was on the mend and actively trying to stabilize her life for the sake of her 2 children. In early 2003, Melanie was preparing for her daughter's upcoming birthday, a milestone that represented her commitment to a new, healthier path. She was not supposed to encounter a predator in a blue van who would end her life and discard her remains in a marshy thicket behind a strip mall. Her disappearance, along with those of 6 others, including Mary Jane Menard and Nilsa Arizmendi, occurred within a single 10-month window. because many of these women lived high-risk lifestyles. The institutional failure of the period meant that their cases were treated as isolated runaways rather than the work of a single, coordinated killer. What Howell did followed a gruesome technical pattern defined by necrophilic coexistence. He utilized his van as a temporary tomb, often sleeping in the back of the vehicle with the bodies of his victims for days or even weeks before disposing of them. He dubbed the van his murder mobile and even installed a wood-burning stove inside to keep himself warm during the winter months while he remained in the company of the deceased. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the topographical blind spot. He chose a burial site behind a shopping plaza at 593 Hartford Road that was so marshy and overgrown that it was deemed impenetrable by casual passers-by. He referred to this dumping ground as his garden, a place where he planted his victims to ensure they would remain his forever, believing the natural terrain would serve as a permanent forensic shield. The pattern remained hidden until April 2004 through a system failure that was finally corrected by a routine search of an impounded vehicle. After Nilsa Arizmendi's family relentlessly pressured police to investigate her disappearance, detectives located Howell's van in New Jersey. Inside, they found a technical failure of his cleanup efforts, a single minuscule bloodstain on the floorboards that matched Arizmendi's DNA. This evidence led to his initial arrest for manslaughter, but the true scale of his crimes remained buried. The institutional failure persisted for years as the remains of his other victims lay just beneath the surface of the garden, while investigators failed to connect the dots between the multiple women who had vanished from the same 3-block radius in 2003. The full scope of the horror was only realized in 2007 when a hunter discovered human remains in the woods behind the New Britain shopping center. Subsequent excavations unearthed the skeletons of Diane Cusack, Joyveline Martinez, and Mary Jane Menard. However, the investigation stalled again for nearly 8 years, until April 2015, when FBI cadaver dogs and high-tech ground-penetrating radar were brought to the site. This secondary search recovered the remains of the final 4 victims: Melanie Camillini, Marilyn Gonzalez, Janice Roberts, and Nilsa Arizmendi. Howell's garden was finally empty. By this time, Howell was already serving a sentence for Arizmendi's death, but the discovery of the other 6 bodies revealed him to be the most prolific serial killer in Connecticut's history. William Devin Howell was sentenced for the remaining 6 murders on November 17, 2017, in a New Britain Superior Court. 2. Avoid the death penalty, which Connecticut had abolished for future crimes, but was still a point of legal maneuvering. He pleaded guilty to all counts. Judge Joan Alexander sentenced him to 360 years in prison, comprised of 6 consecutive 60-year terms. Throughout the sentencing, Howell sat in a wheelchair, a shadow of the man who had terrorized the streets in his van. The courtroom was filled with the families of the victims, who provided gut-wrenching impact statements. Tiffany Menard, the daughter of Mary Jane, addressed the court with a poignant reminder of the institutional invisibility her mother faced, stating that her mother had spent her life helping people society had forgotten, only to be forgotten herself by the system. The Howell case resulted in a massive overhaul of how missing persons cases are handled in Connecticut. It led to the creation of more centralized databases that allow different municipalities to cross-reference disappearances instantly, preventing a WUAT drifter from clearing a city before the police realize a pattern exists. It also highlighted the need for specialized forensic training in cluttered environments, as the initial search of the garden in 2007 had failed to find 4 of the 7 bodies. The case remains a landmark in the study of transient killers, and the specific vulnerabilities of those living on the social and economic fringes of American cities. William Devin Howell didn't have the professional license of Todd Kohlhepp. He had a blue van and a hammer. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators often occupy the space between our vision. The handyman mowing a lawn, the drifter parked in a lot, the person who doesn't belong but isn't quite suspicious enough to report. The irony of his garden was that he believed he was planting something that would grow into a legacy of power. Instead, he planted the very evidence that would eventually ensure he would never see the sun again. He remains in the Cheshire Correctional Institution, a man who spent 10 months of 2003 deciding who would die, and will now spend the rest of his life as a number in a system that finally, belatedly, learned to see his victims. Case 8. Joseph James DeAngelo. Throughout the suburban sprawl of California between 1974 and 1986, a logistical ghost utilized his professional training as a police officer to orchestrate a 12-year campaign of terror that remained unsolved for over 3 decades. While the public lived in a state of escalating panic across 10 different counties, the predator was actually a sworn protector of the law who spent his days on patrol and his nights dissecting residential floor plans with military precision. He didn't just break into homes, he conducted tactical sieges, learning the sleep schedules and intimate habits of his victims before he ever stepped through a window. By the time he suddenly vanished from the forensic record in 1986, he had successfully exploited, say, massive system failure of fragmented pre-digital police databases, ensuring that 3 separate criminal personas were never linked to the same man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, and for 32 years, he lived as a quiet, retired mechanic while his genetic code sat in a freezer, waiting for a forensic technology that had not yet been invented. Joseph James DeAngelo was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, and was raised in the fog of a transient military upbringing that eventually landed him in the heart of California's Central Valley. Following a tour of duty in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, he returned to Sacramento to pursue a degree in criminal justice, a career choice that provided him with a professional shield necessary to hide a burgeoning predatory instinct. By 1973, he was a patrolman in Exeter, California, where he spent his shifts learning the exact response times of emergency services and the technical art of the escape. To his colleagues, he was a dedicated officer with a short fuse. To his future victims, he was a heavy-breathing phantom who seemed to know where their guns were hidden and which floorboards creaked. This dual identity allowed him to move through residential neighborhoods with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where the law was and where it wasn't. The victims DeAngelo targeted were often high-achieving couples like Lyman and Charlene Smith, who were on the mend and enjoying their professional success in the quiet suburbs of Ventura. In March 1980, the Smiths were found murdered in their bed, a crime of such inexplicable brutality that it paralyzed the local community. They were not supposed to be the target of a man who used a log from their own fireplace as a weapon, a man who had spent hours in their crawl space watching them before he struck. Because the Smiths were prominent figures, the institutional failure of the initial investigation saw police focusing on Lyman's legal rivals and business enemies. They failed to realize that the Smiths were simply another entry in a geographic lottery, played by a killer who was traveling hundreds of miles between crimes to ensure no single jurisdiction could ever claim him. What DeAngelo did followed a chillingly modern technical pattern, defined by tactical home invasion. He utilized a technical advantage that few other serial killers possessed. He understood the inner workings of police perimeters and canine tracking. He would often break into a home days before an attack to unload the victim's firearms, hide ligatures under couch cushions, and unlock windows for an easy exit. His signatures were as technical as they were psychological. He would place stacks of dishes on the backs of his male victims while he assaulted the women, telling the men that if he heard a single plate clatter, he would kill everyone in the house. This was a forensic buffer. He used the terror of the moment to ensure his victims were too traumatized to provide an accurate physical description, while he meticulously avoided leaving fingerprints or hair, a discipline he perfected as a trained crime scene technician. The pattern finally broke not through traditional detective work, but through a system failure that was corrected by investigative genetic genealogy. For decades, the case was a cold case graveyard with over 8,000 suspects cleared by traditional blood typing and early DNA tests. The breakthrough came in 2018 when investigators utilized a technical loophole in consumer DNA databases like GED Match. By uploading a crime scene sample from a 1980 murder, they identified distant cousins of the killer. The administrative failure of the past, where DNA was only checked against a small database of known felons, was bypassed by the power of public ancestry data. When the genealogical tree narrowed down to a single man living in Citrus Heights who had been a police officer during the exact years of the attacks, the phantom finally had a face. Following a surreptitious DNA collection from his car door handle and a discarded tissue, police confirmed a 100% match. On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested in his driveway. His reaction was a final technical lie. He began speaking to an imaginary person in the interrogation room, attempting to blame a person named Jerry inside his head for the crimes. Investigators, however, saw through the act, noting that Jerry had conveniently disappeared the moment D'Angelo was fired from the police force in 1979 for shoplifting. The institutional failure of his firing was one of the case's biggest ironies. He was caught stealing a hammer and dog repellent, the literal tools of a home invader. Yet the Auburn Police Department never thought to look at him as a suspect in the East Area rapist attacks occurring in that same zip code. Joseph James D'Angelo was sentenced on August 21, 2020, in a makeshift courtroom in a university ballroom to accommodate the hundreds of survivors. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of uncharged rapes that were past the statute of limitations. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing lasted 4 days, featuring harrowing impact statements from survivors who had waited over 40 years to look their tormentor in the eye. D'Angelo, frail and sunken in a wheelchair, offered a brief, whispered apology. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." It was the first and only time the Golden State Killer spoke directly to his victims. The D'Angelo case fundamentally changed the landscape of modern forensics. It proved that no case is truly cold as long as biological evidence exists, and it pioneered the use of investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, as a standard tool for law enforcement. This case set the legal precedent for how public DNA databases can be used to identify violent criminals, leading to the resolution of hundreds of other cold cases across the United States. It also highlighted the institutional neglect of rape kit processing, prompting states to mandate the testing of backlogged evidence to ensure that future predators cannot hide in the administrative fog, as D'Angelo did for 30 years. Joseph James. D'Angelo didn't have the kill kits of Israel Keys. He had a badge and a patrol car. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who study our defenses from the inside. The irony of his capture was that the very family values and heritage that a man of his generation ostensibly valued were exactly what betrayed him through his relatives' DNA. He remains in the California healthcare facility in Stockton, a man who spent his life watching others from the dark, only to end his life under the permanent, sterile glare of a prison cell, a final system correction for a man who thought he had outsmarted time itself. Case 9. Kendall Francois, on a quiet, tree-lined residential street in Poughkeepsie, New York. A crumbling Victorian home became the site of a 2-year logistical nightmare. Starting in 1996 as a middle school hall monitor, transformed his family's attic into a literal house of horrors. While his co-workers saw a gentle, albeit unkempt, giant who maintained order in school hallways, Kendall Francois was operating within a forensic buffer of domestic squalor and extreme hoarding. He didn't seek out victims in distant cities. He hunted within a few blocks of his own residence, bringing 8 women back to a house he shared with his oblivious parents and sister. For the duration of his spree ending in 1998, the community complained about the unbearable smell of death emanating from the Francois property, but a system failure in local health and police protocols allowed the complaints to be dismissed as a simple issue of poor hygiene. His name was Kendall Francois, and he proved that a serial killer doesn't need a secret lair if the world is willing to look away from a rotting house. Kendall Francois was born on July 26, 1971, in Poughkeepsie, New York, and was raised in the fog of a household that was slowly being overtaken by filth and emotional dysfunction. By his mid-20s, he stood over 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds, a physical presence he used to intimidate the women he encountered on the streets of the Main Street corridor. Despite his hulking frame, he maintained a professional shield by working as a hall monitor, a position of trust that gave him a veneer of civic responsibility. To the students, he was a fixture of their daily lives. To his family, he was the son who stayed in the attic. This compartmentalization allowed him to coexist with the remains of his victims, hiding bodies in crawl spaces and behind boxes of hoarded trash while his family ate dinner just 1 floor below. The victims Francois targeted were women like 25-year-old Gina Barone, who was on the mend and fighting for a future with her 2 young daughters. In November 1996, Gina became the first of 8 women to disappear into the house on Fulton Avenue. She was a woman whose mother refused to let the case go cold, sparking a grassroots search effort that eventually pressured the local police. Because the victims were often associated with the city's marginalized Main Street population, the institutional failure of the Poughkeepsie Police Department was a failure of prioritization. They treated the disappearances as isolated incidents of women leaving town, failing to connect the geographical center of every disappearance, the 1-mile radius around Kendall Francois' home. What Francois did followed a technical pattern of olfactory camouflage. He utilized the sheer volume of hoarded trash and decaying organic matter in his home to mask the scent of human decomposition. When neighbors complained to the health department about the stink, Francois and his family simply blamed it on bad plumbing or rotting garbage. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the domestic fortress. He understood that without a warrant, police could not enter his home, and he used his family's presence as a biological shield. Investigators found it inconceivable that a man could hide multiple bodies in a house where other people lived and slept. This forensic blind spot allowed Francois to continue his spree until the attic literally began to overflow with the evidence of his crimes. The pattern finally broke in September 1998 through a system failure that was corrected by a survivor's escape. a woman managed to flee the Fulton Avenue house after Francois attempted to choke her. Unlike previous victims, she reached the police immediately, providing a specific address and a description of the stink monster who had attacked her. When detectives finally entered the home, they were met with a technical failure of the human senses. The air was so thick with decay that officers had to wear respirators. Behind a false wall in the attic and buried under piles of debris, they found the remains of 8 women. The administrative failure was laid bare. Most of these women had been reported missing years earlier, and their bodies had been sitting less than 2 miles from the police station the entire time. Upon his arrest, Francois exhibited a disturbing, flat detachment. He confessed to the murders with the same tone one might use to describe a grocery list, providing details on how he used his bare hands to strangle each woman. He claimed he didn't know why he did it, only that he felt a need to do so. The institutional failure was further highlighted when it was revealed that Francois had been a suspect in several harassment cases involving women. But because he held a job at the school, he was never seen as a primary threat. His confession was a forensic roadmap of 2 years of undetected violence, conducted in a house that the city had repeatedly cited for nuisance odors, but never actually searched. Kendall Francois was sentenced in August 2000 in a Dutchess County courtroom. To avoid the death penalty, which was a possibility in New York at the time, he pleaded guilty to all counts of first-degree murder. Judge Thomas Dolan sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, the families of the 8 women voiced their collective rage at a system that had ignored their pleas for help. Patricia Barone, Gina's mother, stated that the police had treated our daughters like garbage, echoing the sentiment that the system failure was as much about social class as it was about investigative technique. The Francois case fundamentally changed NY State missing persons protocols. It led to more stringent requirements for police to investigate adult disappearances, especially those involving marginalized populations. It also prompted new public health and safety laws in New York that allow for police entry into nuisance properties if the odor of decomposition is reported. The case remains a harrowing example of domestic serial killing, proving that the most horrific crimes don't always happen in secret dungeons. Sometimes they happen in the house next door, hidden by nothing more than a pile of trash and a community's willingness to look away. Kendall Francois didn't have the badge of Joseph D'Angelo. He had a middle school ID and a rotting attic. He is a reminder that a killer can be hiding in plain sight, even when the entire neighborhood can smell his crimes. The irony of his life was that he was tasked with monitoring children in a school while he was disposing of mothers in his home. He died in prison in 2014 from complications related to cancer, taking the final details of his dark needs to the grave. He remains a symbol of the system failure of the 90s, where the stench of death was treated as a neighborhood nuisance rather than a forensic emergency. Case 10, Darren Dion Van. In the desolate, hollowed-out neighborhoods of Gary, Indiana, a registered sex offender exploited the system failure of urban abandonment to hide a prolific killing spree that only came to light in late 2014. While the city struggled with a dwindling population and over 10,000 vacant buildings, Darren Dion Van realized that these crumbling structures provided a forensic buffer that rendered traditional police patrols useless. He didn't need to build a secret bunker. The city's economic decay had already provided him with hundreds of them. By the time his activities were uncovered, he had turned the Rust Belt ruins into a personal mausoleum, banking on the fact that in a city with so much visible rot, the smell of death would be ignored. His name was Darren Dion Van, and he proved that a predator can remain invisible simply by operating in a place the rest of the country has chosen to forget. Darren Dion Van was born on March 21st, 1971, and spent his formative years in the fog of Gary's decline, a setting that seemingly mirrored his own psychological erosion. After a stint in the U.S. Marine Corps that ended in an other-than-honorable discharge, he drifted into a life of nomadic violence, eventually moving to Texas, where he committed a brutal sexual assault in 2009. Despite his high risk for recidivism, he was released in 2013 and moved back to Indiana. He utilized his technical knowledge of the city's geography to navigate the maze of abandoned homes, using them as both temporary housing and tactical kill sites. To the few who interacted with him, he was a ghost who moved through the shadows of the blighted West Side, a man who the system had labeled a low-level risk while he was actively scouting his next targets. The victims Van targeted were almost exclusively women like 19-year-old Africa Hardy, who were on the mend and trying to navigate the dangerous intersection of poverty and the digital economy. In October 2014, Africa was lured to a Motel 6 in Hammond, Indiana, believing she was meeting a client for a transactional encounter. She was a young woman with aspirations for a better life, but she was not prepared for a predator who viewed her life as disposable. Her murder was the technical catalyst for the entire investigation because it occurred in a relatively well-monitored motel rather than a vacant house. The police were able to secure a digital trail. The institutional failure was the realization that had Van kept his crimes strictly within the abandoned zones of Gary, he likely would have continued his spree for years without interference. What Van did followed a chilling technical pattern of structural sequestration. He utilized the technical advantage of the city's collapsing infrastructure, placing his victims in the basements and crawl spaces of homes that were slated for demolition. He used manual strangulation to ensure the killings were silent, avoiding the ballistics and acoustic signatures that would draw attention in even the most neglected neighborhoods. His signature was the forensic disposal of choice. He would hide bodies in clusters within a few blocks of each other, betting that even if one body was found, the police would treat it as an isolated, drug-related death and fail to search the neighboring ruins. This was a system buffer created by the normalized violence of the area, which Van used to his lethal advantage. The pattern finally broke on October 18th, 2014, through a technical failure involving digital communication tracking. After Africa Hardy was found strangled in the motel room, Hammond police used her phone records to identify the client who had contacted her. They arrested Van at his home in Gary just hours later. The administrative failure was exposed during his first interrogation. Van didn't just confess to Africa's murder. He arrogantly offered to lead police to the others, claiming he had been active for decades. Over the next 48 hours, he led a grim procession of investigators to 6 different abandoned houses, where the skeletal and decomposing remains of 6 additional women, Aneeth Jones, Tayyara Beatty, Christine Williams, and others, were recovered. Most of these women had been missing for months, their cases languishing in the administrative fog of a police department overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the city's problems. Upon his arrest, Van's behavior was marked by a cold, transactional narcissism. He negotiated the locations of the bodies like he was bartering for his life, attempting to trade information for a guarantee that the death penalty would be taken off the table. The institutional failure was further highlighted when it was revealed that some of the abandoned houses where bodies were found had been secured by city contractors months earlier, yet no one had looked inside the closets or crawl spaces. Van's confession provided a forensic roadmap of a predator who saw the city's abandonment as an invitation, describing his victims not as people, but as tasks he had finished in the dark. Darren Dion Van was sentenced on May 25, 2018, in a Lake County courtroom. To avoid the death penalty, the very deal he had tried to broker since the moment of his arrest, he pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder. Judge Samuel Kappas sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each count, to be served consecutively. During the sentencing, the families of the victims filled the courtroom, their impact statements detailing the systemic neglect they felt while their loved ones were missing. The mother of Tyra Beatty voiced the collective pain of the community, stating that the city's rot allowed a monster to eat its children. The Van case resulted in a national conversation about urban blight and public safety. It forced the city of Gary to accelerate its blight elimination program, resulting in the demolition of thousands of abandoned structures that had served as criminal havens. It also led to new sex offender monitoring protocols in Indiana, requiring more frequent and invasive check-ins for offenders who move between states. The case remains a landmark in forensic geography, proving that system failure isn't always about a lack of evidence. Sometimes it's about the physical environment providing too many places for that evidence to be hidden. Darren Dion Van didn't have the professional mask of Todd Kohlhepp or the genetic anonymity of Joseph D'Angelo. He had the thousands of empty rooms of a dying city. He is a reminder that when a society abandons its infrastructure, it creates a forensic no man's land, where the most vulnerable citizens are at the greatest risk. The irony of his life was that he returned to his hometown not to rebuild, but to use its remains as a shroud for his crimes. He remains in the Indiana State Prison, a man whose legacy is etched into the empty lots and demolished blocks of a city that is finally, slowly, trying to clear away the ruins where he once reigned.